Alice, my daughter!
How young is too young? To hang in Tudor England? That question was never asked. Or if it was smothered beneath the roar of a crowd, gathered to watch someone die. On a spring day in the year 1546, in the quiet market town of Much Wenlock, a child was dragged to the gallows and lifted from the earth by a rope, as casually as one might hang laundry to dry. Her name was Alice Glaston. She was no older than 11, perhaps 12 at most. And that morning, she became the youngest known girl to be publicly executed in English history. Not for treason, not for witchcraft, not for anything that would make sense to a modern mind. Some said it was murder. Others whispered theft. But the truth is, we may never know what this child did, or if she even did it before the noose found her neck. We remember King Henry VIII for his 6 wives, for his split from Rome, for the bloody marriage bed and the silenced queens. But few remember that during his 40 years on the throne, he signed off on the deaths of more than 70,000 souls, nearly 3% of the entire population of England at the time. Women were not spared. The poor were not spared. And in the darkest corners of his justice, neither were children. Tudor law was a creature of fear, where punishment was performance, and the executioner played to a crowd. The death penalty was not reserved for monsters or traitors. It could be handed down for cutting down a tree, stealing bread, or in Alice's case, simply being small, silent, and alone. At the time, the age of criminal responsibility in England was 7. 7. If a judge believed a child understood right from wrong, that child could be tried, convicted, and hanged like any grown man. There was no legal protection, no special mercy, no one to stand between a frightened little girl and the scaffold. Alice Glaston did not live in London or some grand city where her case might have sparked outrage or scandal. She came from a small town, a place with dusty roads, market stalls, and weather-worn faces that had seen too much to flinch at the sight of death. Children in such places were used to work, not play. Schooling was rare. Daily life meant chores, silence, obedience, and the hope that poverty wouldn't take you before the winter did. The records of Alice's crime are a blur, inconsistent, vague, stained by time and disinterest. Some say she killed another child. Some say she stole. But all agree on one thing: she was sentenced to hang. There was no lawyer, no defense, no appeals. Her case went before the Assizes travelling courts held a few times each year, where serious crimes were judged swiftly and without sentiment. Alice, small and probably shaking, would have stood alone before men in robes who already believed her guilty. Perhaps the jurors looked at her and saw only an inconvenience. Perhaps they told themselves that fear made better citizens. And perhaps one of them swallowed a lump in their throat and voted for death anyway. April came, and with it, the gallows. Public executions in Tudor England were not hidden things. They were theatre. The scaffold was often placed on a hill or near a crossroads, where everyone could watch. People came from miles around. Some brought their children, others brought bread and wine. Hanging was not just a punishment, it was a warning. And in this case, it was a spectacle drenched in quiet horror. Alice was hanged beside 2 grown men criminals, perhaps whose names history has already allowed to rot. But she was just a girl. She may not have even understood why she was there. She may have cried. She may have tried to stand tall. We will never know. What we do know is that the crowd watched, and no one stopped it. No royal pardon came. No mother ran screaming through the crowd. No priest wept. The rope tightened. The crowd dispersed. And England moved on. The chronicles record her death in a single line. Dry and bloodless, Alice Glaston hanged. And yet that one line has survived for centuries. That one name, short and haunting, has outlived kings, queens, laws, and empires. Not because she was famous, but because the image of a child swinging from a rope is too monstrous to forget. In a time when mercy was weakness, Alice was an offering, a human symbol of Tudor cruelty so cold. It could not tell the difference between a thief and a little girl. Some say she was chosen as an example, that her death was meant to frighten the others, that in a season of unrest, her small body was a message carved into air. No one is untouchable. Not even you. And if that was the goal, it worked. No one remembers the faces in the crowd that day, but they surely remembered hers. This was not just the story of a child who died. This is the story of a country that watched her die. A courtroom that chose silence. A king who never noticed. A justice system that mistook power for righteousness. And a crowd that saw a little girl lifted from the ground and went back to their chores. But we are not finished. This was only the beginning. In the next chapter, we will return to the town that raised Alice Glaston, the market streets she once walked, the church bells she may have heard in the distance, the people who sold vegetables beside the square where she would take her last breath, and we will ask the question that should have echoed across centuries. What kind of world lets a child die for a crime it cannot even name much? Wenlock was not a place made for death, and yet it had seen its share of endings, nestled in the quiet heart of Shropshire, between hills that rose like sleeping giants and winding paths worn down by centuries of passing boots and hooves. It was a town that knew the rhythm of seasons more than the drumbeat of executions. Its people were not warriors or scholars, not bishops or barons, but ordinary souls who bartered in the market square, rang the church bell at dusk, and gathered in silence when the sky turned grey with rain. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where a lost chicken became the business of the entire street, and where news didn't travel, it whispered from one doorstep to the next. On most day, the town woke with the sun, smoke curled from chimneys, the smell of bread warming on stone hearths filtered into narrow lanes, and the church tower cast its long shadow over children who carried water, women who swept stone steps, and men who hauled sacks of barley with shoulders hardened by repetition. Life was quiet, predictably, uncomplicated. And then came the day it wasn't. The morning of the hanging did not announce itself with thunder or plague or the pounding of hooves. It arrived like every other day, with mist on the fields, and the sound of wooden wheels creaking under the weight of fresh produce. But this day would be different, though no one dared to say so aloud. They had heard it in fragments in the days before. Whispers at the well. A name spoken too quickly. A child, they said. A girl. Alice. But when asked, people looked away. They shrugged. Pretended not to know. Pretended not to believe. Perhaps it would not happen. Perhaps the judges would come to their senses. Perhaps the king would send word. A pardon. A stay of execution. Anything but what was scheduled to occur. But by dawn, the gallows had been built. They always built them at the edge of town, where the road split toward the fields, and the sky was open and wide. The scaffold rose like a grim monument against the morning light, hastily constructed with timber beams and an indifferent hand. It was not made to be beautiful, nor to last. It was made to kill, and once it had served its purpose, it would be torn down and forgotten, as if the soil had never drunk blood beneath its shadow. But on that morning, it stood tall and waiting, and the town slowly gathered, not because they wanted to see, but because not going was its own kind of defiance. And no one dared defy the law, not even in silence. They came in groups, hushed and grim-faced. Children walked hand in hand with mothers who told them not to speak, who pulled them close and said, "You must learn what happens to those who sin." Fathers stood with arms folded, their eyes heavy with something between guilt and weariness. There were no cheers, No jeers. No chance of justice. Only the soft murmur of disbelief and the unspoken question, "Are we really going to watch this?" No one answered. Because the answer was yes. And then, she appeared. Alice Glaston was not led to the gallows like a criminal. She was carried by the air around her. Small feet dragging in dirt. Shoulders stooped. Not from shame, but from the unbearable weight of being seen. She was dressed in clothes too large for her frame. Sleeves hanging like ghostly arms. Hem frayed by wear. And her hair, if anyone remembers, was the dull brown of river water. Tangled and windblown. Not the hair of a queen or a witch or a murderer, but of a child who had slept too little and cried too much. She did not cry that morning. Her face was pale. Her lips pressed thin. And her eyes. God help them. Her eyes were searching the crowd for something she never found. There was no mother there to hold her hand. No father to shout her innocence. No friend who dared step forward. Even if there had been, it would not have mattered. The sentence had been given, the rope had been tied, and the law, like the cold wind that pressed against her back, did not flinch. She climbed the steps slowly. Each footfall, a farewell to the world she barely knew. The platform creaked beneath her. Amon stood beside her, reading words she did not understand, announcing crimes no one would repeat, while the other two men groaned, hardened, quiet, waited for their turn to die. She was not like them. She was not like anyone. She was a child on a stage meant for monsters, and the audience, God help them all, said nothing. A silence fell then, deeper than before, deeper than words. It was not the silence of awe or prayer or reverence. It was the silence of knowing. Knowing this should not be. Knowing this would not be undone. Knowing that in a few moments, a little girl would die, and everyone would pretend they had not seen it. Because to see it was to admit something rotten in the heart of the world they called justice. The executioner, faceless in every account, placed the noose around her neck. His hands may have trembled, or they may not have. We do not know. He may have whispered a word of apology, or he may have said nothing at all. There are no records of his expression, no lines written in any ledger about whether his conscience screamed or slept that night. But the noose was tightened, the trap was set, and the sky, ever indifferent, remained cloudless. When the platform gave way, the crowd did not scream. They did not sob or cheer or fall to their knees. They simply stood, watching, remembering, forgetting. One moment she was there, and then she was not. The townspeople would later say very little. They would return to their homes, light fires, borsoup, and tell children to mind their chores. The next day, the market would open again. Fish would be sold, potatus baked, and the gallows would be gone, dismantled by men with calloused hands and quiet mouths, as if it had never been there. But it had, and so had she. Much Wenlock would go on, as towns always do, but somewhere in its soil, beneath cobblestones and moss, there is a place that once held the shadow of a child who died not because she was dangerous, or evil, or even proven guilty, but because a law said she could, and a town, like so many others, chose to watch. They watched her hang, and no one ever spoke her name again. There are places where justice lives, and there are places where justice is performed not for truth, not for mercy, but for the satisfaction of process. The assizes were such places, travelling courts that rolled into towns like Much Wenlock a few times a year. They arrived with little fanfare but immense authority. Men in robes stepped down from carriages, carried with them books and seals, and took seats in makeshift chambers, where the air grew still, and the walls seemed to listen. They were not there to heal wounds or weigh hearts. They were there to pass sentence. And when Alice Glaston was brought before them, there was no one in that room who believed she would leave without the weight of rope on her horizon. The courtroom, if it could be called that, was likely a repurposed hall or parish chamber. A long wooden table, a scattering of benches, windows too narrow to let in the sun. Alice, small as she was, may have been made to stand on something so the men around her could look her in the eye, though one suspects they rarely did. She would have been the only child in the room, the only girl, the only one without power, voice, or shield. No parents flanked her. No counsel stood on her behalf. She faced the judge alone, with only the echo of her footsteps and the rustle of parchment to keep her company. The charge remains a mystery even to this day. Some say murder, whispered without detail, as though attaching such a word to a child made it too difficult to say aloud. Others claim theft perhaps of food, or cloth, or a few coins carelessly dropped. Whatever it was, it had made its way from the mouths of accusers to the ears of the court, and once it had been spoken, it had already become truth. In Tudor England, guilt often arrived before the accused. Trials were not mechanisms for discovering innocence. They were rituals of confirmation, and Alice, barely tall enough to reach the edge of the judge's bench, was never meant to survive hers. She might have been asked questions. Her name, her age, whether she understood what she had done, but the answers would have mattered little, for the law, as it stood, did not bend to children. At 7 years old, a child could be deemed criminally responsible if a judge believed they understood right from wrong. There was no requirement for compassion. No statute that demanded age be considered in sentencing. A child could steal and be whipped. A child could fight and be branded. And if a child committed something the law labelled felony, then that child could hang not as a lesson, but as a matter of course. The jurors were all men, likely farmers, merchants, perhaps even minor landowners, chosen not for wisdom, but for availability. They had no training in law. They had no obligation to question what they were told. And they, too, they would have felt the weight of watching eyes, the pressure of the town, the voice of the judge, the silence of the king's absence. In such a room, to hesitate was to offend the very idea of order. To show pity was to invite suspicion. And so, one by one, they delivered their verdict, not with rage or triumph, but with a kind of practiced numbness that allowed them to eat dinner that night without choking on their conscience. The judge, whoever he was, had no obligation to consider leniency. The Crown had not sent a pardon. There was no reprieve waiting in the wings. The law was his script, and he read from it without blinking. The sentence was death by hanging, not tomorrow, not in a fortnight, but soon. The order would be delivered to the local sheriff. The scaffold would be built, and the girl, the one standing so still beneath the flickering candlelight, would be handed to her fate. It is possible, just possible, that someone in the room wanted to speak up, that a clerk's pen trembled as he wrote the sentence, that a juror clenched his hands beneath the table, that the judge, aged and worn from decades of verdicts, paused for a breath that lasted just a second too long. But nothing was said. No record exists of hesitation. No entry in the rolls mentions doubt. What was written was simple: Alice Glaston, condemned. And after that, the record moves on. As if she were never more than a line in ink, she would have been returned to holding not a cell with iron bars, but perhaps a small chamber in the town hall, a storeroom, or the home of a constable, alone. Again, no visitors, no priest with a book of comfort, no whispered promises that it would all be all right. The clock began ticking the moment the judge spoke, and every hour after that led her closer to the scaffold. Even as the world around her continued on, bread was baked, horses were shoed, markets bustled, and the people who had seen her judged said little, if anything at all. No one remembers what she said in the courtroom, whether she cried, whether she begged, whether she stood silent and stubborn, whether she confessed or denied, whether she even understood what had happened to her. She was a child placed into a machine that had no gears for mercy. A single drop of oil in a system rusted by centuries of fear and obedience. And once she entered, she was not expected to leave. There was no appeal, no delay, no letter to London, no voice in Parliament to raise her name. Alice Glaston was not a noblewoman. She was not married to a traitor or sister to a knight. She was not someone whose death would ripple through court or chamber. She was a girl from a quiet town, whose name carried no weight except the burden of her own sentencing. And so the paperwork was signed, the rope was measured, and the gallows waited. One wonders, in the soft ache of hindsight, whether anyone thought to question it, whether, after the court was dismissed and the judge returned to his lodgings, someone stood by a window and whispered her name, whether the constable tasked with watching her that night lay awake, the sound of her breath heavy in the next room, whether a clerk, that quiet soul who had copied out the judgment, paused, ink still wet, and wished for the first time that he did not know how to write. But the system had spoken, and in the days that followed, no one spoke against it. When the people of Much Wenlock gathered days later to witness her hanging, they were not just witnessing her death, they were witnessing the result of a process that had been designed to run smoothly, without emotion, without interruption. The trial had been brief, efficient, final. It had not been meant to discover anything. It had not been meant to protect her. It had been meant to finish what began the moment someone, somewhere, decided she was a problem too small to matter. And it had done exactly that. There are laws written in ink, and then there are laws written in silence, in what is not said, in what is not protected, in who is never named. In Tudor England, the law had many faces, but none of them looked like a child. It spoke in the voice of kings and judges, in the scratch of a clerk's quill, in the clanging of the prison gate, in the solemn rise of the scaffold, but never in the cries of a little girl or the trembling hands of someone too small to reach the bench. When Alice Glaston was sentenced to die, it was not only a miscarriage of justice, it was the natural outcome of a system that had never learned how to recognize childhood as anything other than a technicality, a footnote beneath a verdict, a smaller body beneath a rope. The age of criminal responsibility, as fixed by English law at the time, was 7. 7, a number that, to us, belongs to milk teeth and lullabies and small hands that still forget how to tie shoes. But in the 16th century, it was considered the threshold at which a child could be deemed capable of malice. If a magistrate or judge believed a child understood the difference between right and wrong, then that child could be arrested, tried, convicted, and executed in the same manner as any man. There was no lesser court, no special provision, no sanctuary, only the expectation that the law was blind, not in its fairness, but in its refusal to look closer. To be fair, some juries did hesitate. They sometimes recommended mercy. They might reduce a charge, delay a sentence, even whisper prayers beneath their breath when a child stood before them small, afraid, barely able to see over the table. But these were acts of conscience, not commands of law. And conscience, in the world of Tudor justice, was something that came after duty, after loyalty, after the performance of process. Judges were not instructed to consider age. Executioners were not trained to weep. The law had no language for innocence, only for guilt and its degrees. And the line between guilt and survival was a tightrope. No child could be expected to walk. Alice's trial, like many others of its kind, treated her not as an exception, but as a participant in a larger pattern, a society increasingly obsessed with control, with obedience, With public demonstrations of authority, the gallows was not just a punishment. It was a message. And the smaller the victim, the louder that message rang. Hanging a man warned other men. Hanging a woman warned their wives. But hanging a child that told the whole world that no one was safe. That even the young, the tender, the not yet shaped, could be broken in full view. And no one would stop it. There are records quiet, sparse, tragic of other children executed during and after Henry VIII's reign. In the year 1629, a boy of 8 was hanged in King's Lynn for arson. In the decades surrounding Alice's death, other boys, barely into double digits, were hanged for theft, for setting fires, for acts that today would lead to counselling, not coffins. In each case, the reasoning was the same. They understood what they were doing, and therefore, they must face what all criminals face. The child's size, their fear, their unfinished understanding of the world, none of that mattered. Only the shadow of malice. Only the interpretation that somewhere, within that small skull, the gears of wickedness had already begun to turn. But how does one measure understanding in a courtroom where no one listens? How does a judge assess the soul of a child who cannot speak for herself? Who has no one to defend her? No words to soften the air between accusation and sentence? The truth is, they didn't. They assumed, they projected, they feared, and they followed a law that gave them no reason to do otherwise. It is important to understand that Tudor England was not merely harsh, it was paranoid. It had suffered plague and rebellion, religious upheaval and foreign threats. The break from Rome had torn the spiritual identity of the nation in half. Kings feared uprisings. Judges feared royal disapproval. Communities feared each other. In such an atmosphere, order was prized above all else. And the instruments of that order, the courts, the sheriffs, the scaffold was sharpened not for fairness, but for efficiency. A child was not a child if she disrupted the peace. She was a disturbance, a risk, a possible symbol of defiance, no matter how small, and the law, already brittle with age and fear, could not afford symbols. Alice Glaston may never have understood any of this. She may not have known what the word felony meant. She may not have known what it meant to be condemned. She may have believed, in her last moments, that someone would come, that a voice would shout enough, that someone would see her not as a name in a book, but as a girl, a child, a daughter. But the law did not have room for such visions. It had no mechanism for hesitation. Once the machinery began to turn, there was no stepping off the track. The judge read the sentence. The town readied the gallows. The law, blind as it was, continued walking forward. It is easy to look back and wonder how it could happen, how a community could allow it, how an entire system could look at a child and see only a criminal. But to the people of the time, it was not extraordinary. It was not even cruel. It was simply the law. And the law, as they had been taught, was a thing to be followed, not questioned. Its cruelty was not a flaw. It was the very point. And that is what makes Alice's death so haunting. Not just that it happened, but that it happened so smoothly, so quietly, so legally. The law could not see a child because it had never tried to look. There is something especially cruel about a sentence that outlives the crime it was meant to punish. In the case of Alice Glaston, the crime itself has dissolved into the fog of forgotten ink, drifting through the margins of half-remembered ledgers and inconsistent whispers, a detail so minor in the eyes of the law that it was never properly preserved, as though what she had done mattered less than the fact that she had done something at all, or, perhaps more chillingly, that she had merely been accused, and yet, centuries later, here we are, still asking the question that no one at her trial cared enough to answer: what, exactly, did this child do? There are versions of the story that suggest murder a word heavy with judgment. dense with implication. Spoken in a low and fearful voice, as though even saying it aloud risks conjuring the spirit of what was lost. But no names of victims remain. No location of the alleged act. No motive. No confession. No context. Only a thin reference in a local chronicle that says she may have been convicted of killing another child. But how, and why, and when? These questions were never recorded. If this was the crime that sealed her fate, it came to court not as a fact, but as a rumor so loosely tethered to truth that it vanished the moment the rope was pulled tight. Other sources claim it was theft, a far more common offense among the poor, particularly for children whose daily lives were spent circling the edge of hunger. If so, it would place Alice in a long line of desperate souls who took what they needed and were punished, as though they had shattered the moral fabric of the kingdom. Theft, in Tudor England, did not mean cunning heists or elaborate schemes. It meant taking bread from a stall, snatching cloth from a cart, or finding a way to survive in a world that rarely made room for those who arrived without wealth or name. Many were hanged for less. A single shilling was enough to send someone to the gallows. It is not hard to imagine a child in patched clothing, stomach hollow and aching, reaching for what should have been hers by right food, warmth, a moment of ease, and being condemned for that instinct alone. But what if it was neither? What if the crime itself was never truly established? What if the accusation was vague, the evidence unspoken, the witnesses uncertain? What if her name was placed on a docket not because of something she did, but because of what she represented: a nuisance, a burden, a symbol of disorder in a town too anxious to tolerate discomfort? In such cases, the line between guilt and inconvenience blurred so easily. And once it blurred, there was no going back. It is difficult for modern minds to comprehend the way justice operated in those days, not as a process of careful deliberation, but as a swift and often brutal means of maintaining control. Trials were short. Records were shorter. The burden of proof was light. And for the poor, especially poor children, the presumption was rarely innocence. If someone said you had done wrong, the wheels began to turn. If no one rose to defend you, the wheels continued. And if your face did not appear in the memory of anyone important, the sentence was delivered and the world moved on. The legal system was not designed to understand children. It was designed to punish them should they fall too far out of line. And so we are left with possibilities, fragments, maybes. Maybe she fought another child and someone died. Maybe she took something from the market and was caught. Maybe she resisted an adult, spoke too loudly, looked the wrong way, crossed a line. No one explained until it was too late. Or maybe she did nothing at all, and her name was simply the one someone reached for when the court needed to make a point. The idea that she may have been entirely innocent is not radical. It is not sentimental. It is, in fact, the most likely possibility of all, because children are often punished not for their actions, but for how those actions make adults feel, for the shame they reflect, for the disruption they cause, for the fact that they remind the powerful of how fragile their power truly is. A child's defiance, a child's mistake, a child's presence, all of these can become dangerous when filtered through the lens of a society that sees obedience as virtue and silence as salvation. Alice Glaston was born into a world that did not trust girls, did not protect the poor, and did not believe that smallness was sacred. Her town, her court, to her kingdom, they all viewed her through the same lens, not as someone worth understanding, but as something to be managed, dealt with, removed. If she was innocent, it did not matter. If she was guilty, it did not make her less a child. And if her crime could not be remembered, then perhaps there never truly was one to begin with. The tragedy of Alice's story is not just that she died, it is that she died without clarity, that she died without justice, that she died, and no one bothered to explain why. Her name survives. Not because she was infamous, but because she was forgotten. She was lost so thoroughly that all we have now is the shape of her ending, not the shape of her life. We know she was young. We know she was hanged. But we do not know what led her there, and that absence echoes louder than any record ever could. In the centuries since, her case has become a symbol not of her crime, but of her erasure. Historians cite her as the youngest girl hanged in England, and then move on. Writers mention her as a footnote in the long shadow of Tudor brutality, but even those acknowledgements cannot touch the quiet horror of her fate. Because the truth is, Alice Glaston may not have committed a crime at all, and even if she did, the punishment she received bore no proportion to the act. What is left, then, is not a question of law, but of memory. How do we remember someone who was never allowed to speak? How do we honor a child whose guilt was never proven, whose life was never recorded, whose death was treated like routine? We remember her not by reconstructing a trial, but by witnessing what it lacked. We remember her by filling the silence with the weight it deserves. We remember her by seeing her as they did not. A girl, a child, a life undone by the certainty of men who never cared to know who she truly was. There are days in history that do not scream, do not burn, do not explode with spectacle or fury. They simply drift in quietly, like morning fog, and leave behind the cold shape of absence. The day Alice Glaston was hanged was not etched into the sky by thunder or marked in royal decree as something notable or rare. It was, by all appearances, an ordinary day in the town of Much Wenlock. The sun rose, as it always did. The carts clattered over cobblestone. The baker kneaded his dough. The horses were fed. The townspeople stirred. And somewhere, in the hush before dawn, a child woke, if she had ever truly slept, and took the first steps of her final morning. It is easy to imagine that those who lived closest to the gallows knew what day it was without being told. They had heard the wood being raised the day before, watched it take shape like a warning finger rising from the earth, tall and still, and splintered at the edges. They had seen the men carry the beams, felt the mood shift in the town square, and they had lowered their voices out of habit, as if silence might somehow keep them safe. And though no official town crier needed to shout the name of the condemned, they all knew, not because the law had told them, but because something in the air had changed, and because she was only a girl. There is something about the death of a child that alters the rhythm of a place. It slows time, thickens it, makes the ordinary feel strange. The morning of the execution, the town did not move faster. It moved with strange hesitation, with a kind of tense ceremony, as if everyone knew they were walking into a memory that would never sit right in the chest. Doors opened more slowly, steps fell more softly, even laughter, if it came, was brittle and dry. And in the midst of it all, the girl they had condemned was dressed and led toward the scaffold. We do not know what she wore. No one wrote that down. But we can guess that it was nothing fine, nothing new. Perhaps the same clothes she had worn in the days before, simple fabric, worn thin by time and washing, perhaps too big in the sleeves, or tight at the neck. She may have had no shoes, or shoes that flapped at the heel, or none at all. Her hair may have been combed by a woman whose hands trembled, or not at all. And as she walked, perhaps she looked at the ground, or perhaps she looked up. Searching for faces, she recognized, finding none. The path to the gallows was not long, but for Alice, it must have felt endless. She would have seen the platform waiting for her, tall and cruel and built for men, not for someone her size. The scaffold did not shrink itself for her arrival. It loomed the same way it always did, casting long shadows in the morning light, standing like a silent witness to its own terrible purpose. She was not the first to die there, but she was. Perhaps the only one whose feet did not reach the edge without help. There may have been a priest. There may not. Sometimes they came. Sometimes they didn't. If he did come, he would have murmured words she barely understood. Promises of peace and forgiveness. Holy whispers wrapped around a punishment the same church once sanctioned. And if no priest arrived, then Alice was left alone. Alone to climb the wooden steps. Alone to face the rope. Alone to stand beside men whose crimes had never been doubted. Whose guilt had never been questioned. Whose deaths were expected, even accepted, but hers. Hers was different. The crowd had gathered, as crowds always did, not because they were cruel, though some might have been, and not because they wanted to see blood, though a few always did. Most came because it was expected, because not going raised questions, because being present was a form of obedience. They stood shoulder to shoulder, shifting on their feet, whispering behind hands. Some brought children. Some clasped rosaries. Some crossed their arms. Others crossed themselves, but none crossed the invisible line that separated witness from action. No one stepped forward. No one shouted stop. And when she stepped into view, they fell even more silent because they saw her. Truly saw her. And seeing her made it worse. She was not an idea. Not a symbol. Not a name on a list. She was a girl. Pale. Thin. Real. And then the executioner stepped forward. We do not know his name. We never do. History rarely remembers the hand that pulled the lever. Only the body that fell. But someone had to do it. Someone had to place the rope around her neck. Someone had to tie it tight. Make sure it would work. Someone had to check the knot. Adjust the length. Stand behind her while she stood trembling. Eyes wide. Hands clenched or hanging limp. Someone had to do it while the crowd watched. While no one spoke. And so he did. Perhaps he said something. Perhaps he didn't. Maybe he whispered a prayer. Maybe he said her name. Maybe he thought of his own children. Or maybe he had none. Maybe he had done this so many times that his hands no longer felt. Or maybe this was the one execution that left his dreams burning. We will never know. We were not in his skin. But the rope was placed, and the platform was ready, and the trap beneath her feet was waiting. There is a moment, just one before the end. A breath held by all. A second when nothing has happened yet and everything has already been decided. The town stood in that moment. The rope held its shape. The sky held its stillness. The girl held whatever was left inside her. And then the wood gave way. There was no scream. There was no thunder. Only a sound. One of those sounds that should never belong to a child. And then, stillness. The kind of stillness that settles over a field after something has fallen. The kind of stillness that makes the birds stop singing. The kind of stillness that knows it cannot be undone. Alice Glaston was dead. Her body hung beside two men, but it was hers that no one would forget. Because even though the law had said it was right, and the court had said it was necessary, and the people had said nothing at all, there is a silence that follows. Such a death, a silence that does not fade, even after centuries. A silence that clings to every word not spoken, to every step not taken, to every hand that remained folded when it should have reached out. The day the rope chose. Her neck was not the day the world stopped. It was not even the day the town changed. But it was a day that should never have been possible. And it happened anyway. It is one thing to speak of the rope, of the scaffold, of the judge's pen and the executioner's hands. But it is another thing entirely to speak of the eyes, the watching, the stillness of the many who stood just far enough away to be innocent, yet close enough to know exactly what was being done. For Alice Glaston did not die in the shadows. She was not dragged away in the night or lost to some silent dungeon. She died beneath the open sky, with the full light of morning pouring down on her small shoulders, and she died in front of them, a crowd of neighbours. of shopkeepers, of farmers and wives and children who had walked the same streets she had, bought bread from the same stalls, nodded in passing, or perhaps even once held her hand. They were not monsters. That is what makes it worse. They were ordinary, familiar, human, and they stood there anyway. Some would say they had no choice, that the law was the law, and it was not for them to question it, that if they had spoken, they would have risked their own safety, that they, too, had children to feed, lives to keep, futures to guard. Others would say they were simply curious, that executions had always been public, always been events, a grim theatre where the ticket was paid, not in coin, but in presence. And still others might say that they came not to see her die, but to prove something to themselves, that they could bear it, that they could stand there, still and unmoved, and not be broken by the sound of a child's last breath. But whatever they told themselves, they stood, and they watched. They watched as she was led through the town, her footsteps smaller than the path beneath them. They watched as she climbed the scaffold, her frame lost in the size of it. They watched as the rope was placed, as the final words were spoken, as the silence thickened into something almost holy, and then they watched as her body fell. Some turned away, some closed their eyes. A few, perhaps, let a single tear slip from the corner of their cheek before swallowing it like shame. But most remained still. Most held their breath, and then exhaled, and then, without speaking, let the moment pass into memory. They did not scream. They did not protest. They did not run forward and demand it stop. They let it happen. And when it was done, they went home. What does it mean to be a witness? Not in the eyes of the court, but in the eyes of time. It means that part of the story belongs to you, not just the ending, but the silence that wrapped around it, the quiet choices, the looking away, the decision, moment after moment, to not interfere. And that is what the crowd became. Not a mob, not an audience, but a collection of small silences, stacked one atop the other, until they built the platform higher than wood alone ever could. No one from that crowd would ever be punished. No one would be blamed. Their names would not appear in any ledger. Their hands would remain clean. And yet, somewhere in the hush of history, their presence remains not as shouts or stones, but as an echoing absence of mercy. Perhaps, the next day, they spoke of it over dinner. Perhaps they told their children to behave, to listen, to obey, and reminded them of what they had seen. Perhaps they used Alice's name like a warning, like a myth meant to mold behavior. Or perhaps they said nothing at all. Perhaps they tucked the image away, buried it beneath routine, and convinced themselves that time would soften the edges, that what they had witnessed was necessary, lawful, ordained, that she had deserved it, that they had done nothing wrong. But guilt does not need to roar to be real. It can live in quiet places, in the hesitation before a prayer, in the way one avoids a certain path, in the pause before answering a child's question. And in much Wenlock, there would have been many such pauses, many small shadows left behind by a single, unspoken name. It is possible that some regretted it, that in the days and years that followed, when the gallows was long gone and the town had returned to its patterns, they remembered her, that on quiet mornings, when the sun broke, the mist just right, they saw her shadow walking past the baker's door. That in the voice of another child crying. They heard something familiar, a note of fear, a pitch of helplessness, and felt the memory return, unbidden and unwelcome. Or maybe they forgot. Maybe the world moved on so completely that Alice's name was never spoken again. Her death, nothing more than a smudge in the town's long record. Maybe generations passed before anyone thought to ask who she had been. Maybe that silence became so thick that it felt like stone. too heavy to move, too old to break. But history does not forget everything, and though it lost the details, her voice, her laugh, her crime, her final words, it kept enough to haunt, enough to remind us that it was not the judge who stood alone in that moment. It was not the executioner, nor the clerk, nor the rope itself that bore the full weight of the ending. It was the crowd, the ones who stayed silent, the ones who did nothing, the ones who watched. When the gallows came down, there was no monument raised in its place. The wooden beams that had held her were pulled apart, likely burned or reused without thought. Stripped of their history, the way the world often strips its worst memories of form, the soil where she had stood was walked over, swept, perhaps even paved years later, as if the earth itself had agreed to forget. No stone was set, no prayer was carved, no name was whispered in public again, and yet somehow, Alice Glaston remained, not in body, not in voice, not even in the details of her crime, which vanished so completely from record that it is no longer known whether she stole bread or took a life or did nothing at all. She remained, instead, in absence, in the strange, echoing shape of a silence that refused to collapse, in the horror that no one spoke aloud, but which lingered in the corners of candlelit rooms, in the pause between sentences when the wind blew in the same direction it had on the morning she died. This was not the kind of legacy anyone chooses. It was not built with intention. It did not grow from books or titles or the kind of reverence granted to kings or saints. It came instead from the fact that her death was too quiet, too unchallenged, too normal. It was the quiet that made her unforgettable, because in that quiet, something broke, not in her, but in us. The world that watched her hang did not crumble. The sun rose again. The market reopened. The judges returned to their circuits. The sheriffs continued to deliver sentences. But something beneath all that, something unspoken, something deep had shifted, not for the people who lived then, perhaps, not immediately, not in ways they could name, but for those who came after, for us, for anyone who, looking back, sees not a criminal child, but a broken mirror, reflecting a justice system that had learned to move without conscience. There is a reason Alice's name survives. When so many others have been lost, it is not because she was the only child executed in Tudor England. She was not. Records exist of boys as young as 10, even 8, being sentenced to death for crimes like arson or theft. But Alice was different. She was a girl. She was 11. She was hanged in public, with grown men beside her, and no one intervened. The absurdity of that image, the smallness of her against the backdrop of death, burned itself into the edge of history. Not as a headline, but as a question that still makes the skin crawl. How could this happen? Why did no one stop it? What does it say about a world where a child can be killed? And the only thing recorded is the fact that it happened. In later centuries, as ideas of childhood began to change as societies slowly, painfully came to understand that children are not miniature adults, that they deserve protection, patience, and the freedom to make mistakes, Alice's story began to take on a different tone. It became a symbol, not of her guilt, but of the guilt of a system that had no place for mercy. Historians would note her name with sorrow. Teachers would mention her as a cautionary tale. And writers would place her in lists of the most tragic and bewildering executions in British history. But no one ever recovered her voice. No one ever found a diary or a letter or a drawing that might have told us who she really was, what she liked, what frightened her, what she dreamed of when she looked out the window or lay awake at night listening to the creak of floorboards above her head. Her life, however long or short it truly was, has been compressed into a sentence. The youngest girl hanged in England, and that, in itself, is the final cruelty, that a child whose last breath was taken by the will of the state whose body was buried without record, whose name was spoken only once in official decree, has become little more than a footnote, a symbol of what should never have been allowed. And yet, in another way, that very silence became her voice. Because even in that void, even in the lack of details, the lack of gravestones, the lack of explanation, she is still remembered. And that memory, carried not by monuments but by the weight of what was left unsaid, has become a form of resistance. Every time her story is told, however briefly, it pushes back against the silence that killed her. Every time her name is spoken with tenderness instead of accusation, she is reclaimed from the machinery that once discarded her. That is legacy. Not fame, not honor, not power, but memory. Memory that hurts. Memory that lingers. Memory that asks us to look at what we allowed and what we might still be allowing. In different forms. With different names. In different scaffolds we pretend not to see. Alice Glaston may never have imagined a world where she would be remembered. She may have died believing no one would speak for her. No one would cry for her. No one would care. And in her time, that was true. But the silence that swallowed her did not last. It cracked. It leaked. And from that crack, her story rose. Quiet but enduring, not because someone recorded it with love, but because the horror of her death made forgetting impossible. And perhaps that is what makes her story so heavy to carry. It is not that we know too much. It is that we know so little, and that little is more than enough to break the heart. Some stories do not end with a door closing, or a final word, or a great reckoning. Some stories end in the way a candle dies, not in flame, but in smoke. The story of Alice Glaston is one of those stories, one that never found its justice, one that left no heirs, no letters, no legacy written in ink, and yet she has remained. For centuries, she has remained not because the king remembered her, not because the law made amends, but because something deep inside us refuses to forget her. She was, by all accounts, a girl the king never knew existed. Henry VIII was alive when she died, still on the throne, still writing edicts, still signing names beneath executions. But Alice's life was not important enough to reach his ears, not significant enough to climb the walls of his court. She was just a name in a small town, far from London, far from thrones and tapestries and the roar of Parliament. And so the decision to kill her was not made in the halls of power, but in a courtroom thick with dust and fear, by men who did not see her. Not really, because had they seen her, they might have stopped. But they did not, and neither did he. Henry VIII died in the same year Alice did. By then, his body had swollen with illness, his mind clouded with suspicion. He had already ordered the execution of 2 of his wives. Countless nobles, and anyone who had dared challenge his will, he ruled with dread, with distance, with a pen that signed death like it was ink on a bill of trade. But what lingers is not just that he executed queens. What lingers is that a child died under his reign, and he never even looked in her direction. This is the story of a child the king couldn't see, and the world she was asked to live in because of it. We do not know what Alice believed in, whether she prayed in the old way or the new, whether she knew the names of saints or if she had ever stepped inside a church. But if she did pray, if she did look upward in those final days and ask for something, anything she did, so not as a criminal or a sinner, but as a child, and it is that small fact, that single truth, that has outlasted every forgotten detail of her crime, or lack thereof. It is what turns the weight of her story from history into warning, because we still live in a world where people go unseen. We still live in a world where the small are overlooked, where the powerless are silenced, where the ones without name or title or voice are punished in ways that history may never write down. And while our laws may have changed, and our scaffolds may now stand in metaphor instead of wood, The risk remains that silence becomes routine. That distance becomes comfort. That the people with power forget to turn their heads toward the people who need to be seen the most. So what do we do with a story like this? We remember her. Not as a symbol, not as a headline, not even as a victim, but as a child, a full, living, breathing child who once walked the crooked lanes of a market town, who may have laughed on some long-forgotten morning, who may have run with bare feet over wet grass before the weight of the world ever found her. We say her name, not to glorify the past, but to hold a mirror to it. We let her story soften us. We let it remind us that law without compassion is not justice. That order without mercy is not peace. And that the worst things done in human history were not always done in secret. Many were done in public, while others simply watched. Alice Glaston never grew old, never had children, never wrote a word that could survive her. But somehow, her story has passed through time, like a whisper that refuses to fade. And now it is ours to carry not just the horror, but the lesson, the tenderness, the ache. So tonight, before you close your eyes, let her rest in your memory, not swinging in the gallows, not standing on the scaffold, but somewhere quieter, somewhere kinder. Imagine her sitting beneath a tree. Imagine her with a doll, or a ribbon in her hair, or a book too big for her lap. Imagine her laughing and free, because that is the ending she deserved. And if history could not give it to her, perhaps we can. Good night. Alice, we see you now. We will not look away.
Do you have anything to say in your defense?
Alice Glaston, you are to be hanged by the neck until dead!
No.
Please, no! I am innocent!
May the Lord have mercy on your soul.
May God have mercy on your soul, my child. No!
Alice, my child, no, he's...
No, please! Mother!
Alice, my daughter.
Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.
Dear God, forgive me for my sins.